Welcome back to Built Before Us. If you've been following the channel for a while, you already know that many modern cities are not as modern as they appear. Today I want to focus on London, a city we usually describe as medieval, shaped by Roman origins, and constantly rebuilt to fit modern life. But here's something most people rarely stop to consider. London did not simply replace its past. In many cases, it buried it. Beneath busy roads, underground stations, and office buildings, there are older streets, walls, and entire sections of the city that once functioned as everyday London. They are not ruins in distant fields. They sit directly below the places people walk through every day. This video is not about secrets or hidden plots. It's about how cities grow, how memory fades, and how history can disappear without ever being destroyed. Instead of looking at London from above, we're going to move downward, layer by layer, and see what the city is really built on. When people talk about London's history, it is usually described as a sequence of stages, starting with Roman London, followed by Saxon settlement, then medieval growth, and finally the modern city we see today, as if each phase replaced the one before it. But that description quietly assumes something important, which is that cities erase their past before moving forward, and that assumption does not match what exists beneath London's streets. The real question is not whether Roman or early medieval London existed, because that is already accepted, but whether those earlier cities truly disappeared or whether they continued to exist in a different form, hidden below newer layers of urban life. So the central question of this episode is simple but important. Is London a single historical city, or is it a stack of multiple cities built one on top of another, each still physically present beneath the next? This leads to a second question that is often ignored, which is why these buried streets, walls, and neighborhoods are rarely part of how London is discussed or understood by the public. There is no mystery about why these layers exist, because fires, floods, rebuilding, and expansion are well documented. But there is a deeper issue in how history is framed and which parts of a city are considered worth remembering. This episode is not asking why these cities were hidden, because in many cases they were not hidden at all, but instead asks why modern history focuses on what is visible above ground while overlooking the infrastructure and everyday spaces that once defined urban life. The usual story of London is clear and familiar, and it is often taught as a clean progression from one period to the next, where each new city replaces the old one as time moves forward. According to this version of history, Roman London declined and was largely abandoned. Saxon settlement shifted the city's center, medieval London rebuilt from earlier ruins, and the modern city later expanded over everything that came before it. On the surface, that explanation seems reasonable, because the London we see today does not look Roman, and very little of the ancient city is visible at street level. But when archaeologists, engineers, and builders dig beneath modern London, they encounter something very different from a story of disappearance or replacement. Roman roads appear several meters below modern streets, following the same directions and layouts that still guide traffic today, even though their original surfaces are long out of sight. Stone walls that once defined the edges of Roman London are found reused as foundations for medieval structures, not dismantled or removed, but incorporated into later buildings as if the city simply grew upward around them. Property boundaries in parts of the city still follow Roman and early medieval lines, even though the structures that created those boundaries vanished centuries ago, leaving invisible patterns that continue to shape modern neighborhoods. This creates a clear contrast between what history often describes and what the ground itself preserves. History tells us that cities collapse, disappear, and restart, while the physical evidence shows continuity, reuse, and gradual accumulation. Instead of seeing a clean break between Roman, Saxon, and medieval London, what appears underground is a slow layering process, where older streets were covered, walls were absorbed, and living spaces were raised rather than erased. The difference matters because a story of replacement suggests loss and rupture, while a story of accumulation suggests that cities behave more like evolving systems than like abandoned ruins. When we rely only on visible monuments and surviving buildings, it becomes easy to imagine that earlier Londons are gone. But when we look beneath the surface, we see that those cities are still there, performing a different role. They are no longer places where people live and work, but they remain active as foundations, retaining walls, drainage channels, and structural support for the city above. What we are told focuses on what stands above ground, while what we see underground tells a quieter story about how cities actually survive, adapt, and continue without fully letting go of their past. When we talk about a buried city, it is easy to imagine scattered ruins or isolated artifacts, But beneath London, the evidence is far more complete and far more organized than that image suggests. Across construction sites, transportation projects, and archaeological surveys, entire Roman streets have been uncovered several meters below modern ground level, complete with stone surfaces, drainage channels, and worn wheel ruts that show long-term daily use. These are not symbolic remains or ceremonial spaces, but functional urban infrastructure, built to support traffic, trade, and movement across the city. In many locations, the depth of these streets is not the result of a single event, but the outcome of repeated rebuilding cycles where each new surface was laid slightly higher than the last, slowly raising the level of the city over centuries. Major fires, including those in the Roman period and later medieval London, produced vast amounts of rubble that was often leveled rather than removed, creating a stable base for new construction. Flooding from the Thames and its tributaries added layers of sediment, especially in low-lying areas, further burying older streets and structures beneath natural deposits. Lost rivers such as the Walbrook, once open and central to Roman London, were gradually confined, redirected, or built over, leaving behind channels that still influence drainage and ground conditions today. In some cases, Roman buildings were preserved precisely because they were buried, sealed off from weather and later disturbance, allowing walls, floors, and even decorative elements to survive in better condition underground than they would have above ground. These buried spaces are not evenly distributed, which means that modern London sits on an uneven archaeological landscape, where some areas rest directly on Roman levels while others are separated by several meters of accumulated history. What is especially striking is how often these remains appear directly beneath modern infrastructure, such as roads, rail lines, and underground stations, creating a literal overlap between ancient and contemporary movement. For example, sections of the London Underground pass near or through areas that once functioned as Roman streets and buildings, meaning that daily commuters travel alongside layers of the city they rarely know exist. This physical proximity highlights an important point, which is that the buried city is not remote or abstract, but woven into the functioning body of modern London. The evidence also shows that burial was not a sign of abandonment, but a method of continuity, allowing the city to adapt to environmental pressure, population growth, and changing needs without relocating or starting from scratch. Instead of clearing old layers away, London accumulated them, turning past streets into foundations and past buildings into structural support. Seen this way, the buried city is not a failure of preservation, but a record of how urban life sustained itself over long periods of change. To understand why so much of London was buried rather than removed, it helps to stop thinking like a modern city planner and start thinking like someone responsible for keeping a city functioning with limited tools, limited time, and constant pressure. Clearing an entire neighborhood down to bare ground was not a simple task in the Roman or early medieval world, because removing stone, brick, and compacted debris required enormous labor, and that labor did not improve daily life as directly as building something new. Raising street levels, on the other hand, solved several problems at once, because it allowed new construction to begin immediately while also improving drainage, reducing flood risk, and creating firmer ground for future buildings. In a city shaped by the Thames and its tributaries, higher ground meant safer ground, and over time this practical response to flooding gradually lifted the city above its earlier surfaces. Existing walls and foundations were not viewed as obsolete, but as valuable structural assets, because well-built stonework could carry weight for centuries and offered a reliable base for new construction. From an engineering perspective, reusing these elements made sense, because they were already aligned with streets, property boundaries, and infrastructure networks that people depended on. Urban continuity mattered more than historical preservation, and cities were expected to work first and remember later, if at all. As populations grew and commerce expanded, space became more valuable than visibility, which meant that building upward and forward was often preferable to preserving what lay below. This approach also reduced disruption, because daily life could continue around construction rather than stopping entirely for large-scale clearing projects. Over time, this logic created a layered city, where older structures quietly supported newer ones, even as their original purpose faded from memory. What looks like neglect from a modern perspective was often a rational decision based on cost, labor, and survival, rather than ignorance or indifference to the past. The result is a city that appears unified at street level, but is structurally dependent on many earlier versions of itself. London did not bury its past because it failed to value it, but because it relied on it, using earlier work as a foundation for future growth. Seen through this lens, burial becomes a sign of continuity and adaptation, not collapse, and the city's hidden layers begin to look less like lost history and more like the internal structure of a living system. As London continued to grow and rebuild, awareness of the city's deeper layers did not disappear all at once, but gradually faded as daily function became more important than historical memory. For most residents, older streets and buildings stopped being places people used and became surfaces people walked over, and once that shift occurred, there was little reason to record or remember what lay beneath. Written history tends to focus on events, rulers, and visible landmarks, while infrastructure that supports everyday life is rarely described in detail unless it fails or causes problems. As a result, the working parts of the city, such as roads, drainage channels, and foundations, quietly disappeared from the historical narrative even though they remained physically present. Over generations, this created a growing gap between what the city was made of and what people believed it to be. Medieval and later historians often described London in terms of what they could see and use, not what they inherited, which meant that earlier urban layers were treated as background rather than as subjects worth discussing. This process did not require deliberate suppression or secrecy, because forgetting can happen naturally when structures continue to function without drawing attention to themselves. A Roman wall that supports later buildings does its job silently, and once it no longer defines a boundary or carries symbolic meaning, it fades into anonymity. Public history reinforces this pattern by prioritizing monuments that can be visited and admired, while everyday spaces that shaped most people's lives remain invisible, even when they survive underground. The result is a version of history that feels simpler and more linear than reality, because it removes the complexity of long-term urban continuity. When older cities are treated only as precursors rather than as physical components of the present, their role in shaping modern life is minimized. This historical gap matters because it affects how cities understand themselves, encouraging the idea that progress replaces the past instead of building upon it. In London's case, the buried city was not lost through destruction, but through a slow shift in attention, where function replaced memory and use replaced awareness. What remains underground is not just stone and soil, but evidence of how easily entire urban worlds can fade from discussion while still holding up the city above them. When we step back and look beyond London, it becomes clear that what lies beneath the city is not an exception, but part of a much wider urban pattern that repeats across history and geography. Cities like Rome, Paris, Istanbul, and Athens are often described through their monuments and skylines, yet beneath their streets exist earlier versions of the same cities, preserved not as museums, but as working foundations. In Rome, ancient roads still define modern traffic routes, even when the original surfaces are buried several meters below ground, shaping movement without being seen. In Paris, medieval streets sit below later renovations, and entire neighborhoods were razed rather than removed during periods of flooding, sanitation reform, and expansion. In Istanbul, layers of Byzantine and Roman infrastructure continue to support modern buildings, markets, and transport systems, even though most residents interact only with the uppermost layer of the city. What these cities share is not a single historical event, but a shared logic of growth, where building over the past was often more efficient than starting fresh. This pattern suggests that many modern cities function as active archaeological sites, where daily life unfolds on top of inherited structures that still influence stability, layout, and movement. London fits squarely within this pattern, yet it is often discussed as if its buried layers are unusual or marginal, rather than central to how the city operates. The reason for this disconnect is not a lack of evidence, but a tendency to equate history with visibility, giving priority to monuments that rise above ground while ignoring the infrastructure that made urban life possible. When cities are viewed this way, buried streets and neighborhoods feel incidental, even though they often carried more people, goods, and daily activity than the structures we choose to celebrate. Seen in a broader context, London's hidden cities are not anomalies waiting to be explained, but examples of a common urban process, where continuity matters more than preservation and function outweighs memory. This wider pattern challenges the idea that modern cities are clean breaks from the past, and instead suggests that they are layered systems, carrying forward the physical decisions of earlier societies in ways that remain structurally essential. Understanding London as part of this global pattern helps shift the focus away from mystery and toward recognition, reminding us that many cities are older, deeper, and more complex than their surfaces suggest. When we step back from the details and look at London as a whole, the city begins to feel less like a single historical place and more like a layered organism that has grown over time. Each generation did not erase what came before it, but added another layer that responded to new pressures, new needs, and new ways of living. Seen this way, the buried streets and buildings beneath London are not failures of preservation, but evidence of continuity, showing how the city adapted without breaking from its past. Modern London functions because earlier London still exists beneath it, carrying weight, directing movement, and shaping space even when their original purpose is no longer remembered. This challenges the common idea that history sits behind us, locked in museums or textbooks, because in cities like London, history is physically present and actively involved in everyday life. The ground beneath our feet holds decisions made centuries ago, and those decisions continue to influence how the city works today. Thinking about London in this way changes how we understand modern cities more broadly, because it suggests that urban life is not built from clean starts, but from accumulated choices. Progress does not always mean replacement, and growth does not always require destruction. Instead, cities often move forward by relying on what already exists, even when that reliance is hidden from view. This perspective also raises a quiet question about other cities we think we understand. How many modern streets follow ancient paths, and how many buildings rest on foundations whose origins are no longer discussed? London is not unusual in this regard, but it offers a clear example of how urban memory can sink below the surface while remaining structurally essential. By recognizing cities as layered systems rather than isolated historical moments, we gain a more honest understanding of how the built world evolves. What lies beneath London is not a forgotten mistake, but a reminder that cities are deeper, older, and more continuous than they appear. If this way of looking at London changed how you think about the city, take a moment to like the video, because it helps more people find these kinds of stories. If you want to keep exploring how modern places are built on much older foundations, consider subscribing to Built Before Us, where we focus on how cities, structures, and systems carry their past forward into the present. I'd also like to hear from you in the comments. Are there other cities you've walked through that felt older than they looked, or places where history seems to exist just beneath the surface? Let me know which city you'd like us to explore next, or what part of urban history you think is often overlooked. These episodes are shaped by curiosity, observation, and the questions we choose to ask together. Thanks for spending this time with me and for looking a little deeper at the places we usually take for granted. This is Built Before Us,